Hi, everyone, and welcome to Festival Place the Pineapples in association with the Design Council for our free lunchtime talk. My name is Christine Murray. I'm the director of the Festival of Place and editor-in-chief of The Developer. If this is your first time on AirMeet joining us today, I'll invite you to use the chat to your right to introduce yourself, share your comments, or swap links. Some people have already spotted the emojis. Do feel free to send us your comments and to our speaker today, who will be grateful for your communication. And our speaker will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll be taking your questions. So if you would like to put those into the Q&A, it's just above the chat. There is a Q&A there. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bernard Hay, who's going to be talking about Design Economy 21, a national research project about how we calculate the value of design. Bernard is a design researcher, writer, curator, and educator. And prior to this, he was senior learning producer and research lead at the Design Museum, where he oversaw the museum's adult learning, higher education, and access programs. And since 2019, he's been an associate lecturer in design theory and social innovation at the University of the Arts, London. So Bernard, please join me.
Hi, thanks so much, Christine. And it's lovely to be in this space with all of you. So thank you for joining this session for your lunchtime. So as Christine said, I'm going to share a little bit about some current work that we're doing at Design Council to measure the social, environmental, and economic value of design. And I'm going to try and share my slides now. So this is the moment of truth. Let's have a go.
You're getting lots of applause for your slides. Good job.
Great. Can everyone see it?
Yeah, that's perfect. So Bernard, I'll be back after your talk for the Q&A.
Brilliant. Sounds good. So as Christine said, I'm going to really focus this session sharing with you a kind of project that we're running called Design Economy 2021. This is a project that we started about 6 months ago. We were working with University of Arts London Social Design Institute and BOP Consulting, really to develop a new methodology and approach to capture design's social, economic, and environmental value. And what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be starting that research over the summer of this year. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to kind of give you a kind of talk of two halves. Firstly, I'd like to say a little bit about what we already know about the value of design based on previous iterations of this research. And then second of all, to give you a bit of an insight into the approach and the ambitions that we've got for the work this year. But before getting started, just to share with those of you that aren't familiar with Design Council a little bit about who we are and what we do. So we were founded in 1944 by Sir Winston Churchill's government. And we had the remit of really harnessing the power of design to support the UK's recovery in the post-war period. And of course, design has evolved a lot since then, as has the world that we live in. And so we now champion the power of design and architecture to address some of the biggest challenges of our time. And we do that as both an independent charity and the government's advisor on design. And so our mission is basically to make life better by design. And we do that through developing new policy recommendations, through design support and training programs, also through independent advice. And last but by no means least, also through the research that we do into the state of design in the UK. So before going on to say a little bit about what we already know about the value of design, I just wanted to start with a bit of a definition. Design means lots of different things to different people. And at Design Council, we understand it as follows. So whereas you might think of design as being about the designed things that we make in the world, so buildings, products, services, a lot of our work tends to focus on design as an activity and a process. So for us, design is about a lot more than aesthetics or appearance. We see it as a mindset and a skill set that combines critical thinking and creativity. And over the years, we've developed this 3H framework, which for us kind of encapsulates the mindsets and the skills and capabilities that designers have. So firstly, design involves a lot of cognitive skills. It's about creative problem solving, that ability to visualize and conceptualize things that don't yet exist. And when we do design, it's not simply, for the sake of doing design, it's to serve a purpose. And so design has to be an empathic discipline so that we're responding to the needs, the aspirations, and the desires of communities, of the planet, or of non-human life forms. And of course, design isn't simply about having great ideas, it's about realizing actual things in the world. And so for us, design is also integrally tied with practical skills and technical abilities that enable that end goal to be reached. So that could be things like prototyping or being able to facilitate workshops, sketching or CAD, whatever you name it. Now, if it's the case that you have that kind of idea of design, then as you'll all immediately realize, it's incredibly broad. It encompasses different professions from architecture to urban planning to graphic design and product design. And designers obviously then operate across the whole of society and the economy. They shape our built environment, the products and services we use, and the digital world. And they also work across industries. So whilst we have design firms and architecture studios, designers often operate also in other spaces like financial services and marketing. So when we say we're looking at the design economy, which is the kind of core part of this work, what we refer to is the design activity that happens across the whole of the UK society. It's work that's carried out by designers and design skilled workers. But also when we look at design firms and architecture studios and the value they bring, we also recognize and factor in the value that comes from support staff, such as administrators, those that oversee distribution and supply, those other people that are integral to realizing design in the world. So as this is a talk about the value of design, I also felt like I had to say a little bit about what we mean by value. It obviously means lots of different things to different people. And the first thing that it kind of conjures up in our minds often is it's about profit, it's about the number of pounds that something makes. But what we're trying to do with this research is to kind of take a little bit more of an abstract view. And for us, value very simply can be defined as what matters to different stakeholders. So it might be that we look at a piece of design and we say, well, what's really important is that design generates profit. And then the profit is what we take to be the value. But we could also say that actually what we're really interested in is creating a piece of design that creates a sense of community belonging. And in that case, that's also valuable too. I think it's kind of important to share this because it has two really big implications for when we used value in our decision-making about design and also in what it means to research it. So the first one is if value is a kind of judgment and it's subjective, we need to always ask who is getting to decide what is valuable around a design project, what sort of goals and aspirations should it be aiming for, and how can we allow multiple voices to shape the discussion on what things we take to be valuable in the first place. And the second implication is that when we're doing research at this kind of scale, we rely on a lot of pre-existing data. And obviously that data has been shaped by pre-existing values and preferences that those individuals that undertook that research have had. So an example of that is we do a lot of work into the demographics of the design sector. And a lot of the data that's already on that is structured around binary gender categories of male and female. And obviously that reflects histories of preferences and biases that we need to kind of address within this research. And so the question with value is always, what are the gaps in the data? What do we not have evidence for? How can we fill and address those gaps? And also how can we acknowledge those lack of plural voices or other conceptions of value in any of the work that we're doing? So what do we already know about the value of design? So Design Council has been doing this research for quite a while. And what you can see here is a few of the reports that we've been doing since around the 90s, which have tended to focus on looking at the economic value of design. So what are the financial benefits that design brings to businesses and to the UK? But we've also done a lot of research as well into the kind of value of architecture and urban design in the built environment. So as many of you will know, Design Council merged with CABE in 2010, so the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. And they brought with them a wealth of research and reports that they've been doing into the value of architecture that stretch back at least as far as 2001. And as a side note, I highly recommend having a look online and reading some of those if that's an area that you're interested in. But our last two reports were these ones. The first was our last version of Design Economy, which really sought to understand what is the economic value of design to the UK and what benefits does it offer to businesses. And the second one was Designing a Future Economy, which asked what is the value of design skills to the UK, where those skills might be used by professional designers or architects, but also might be used by those in other professions outside of what we might traditionally call design. And so here's some of the kind of facts and the figures that kind of came out of that research. So the first one is that in 2016, design generated huge amounts of gross value added for the UK economy, about 85.2 billion. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that figure, that's about 75% of the total contribution of the financial services sector that year, which I think is kind of quite startling when you think about, how much we talk about banks being too big to fail. We often didn't say the same about the design economy, but it's clearly a huge part of what we do. And it's also a massive source of jobs and employment. So around 1.69 million people work across the design economy, of which around 1.3 million are designers. And there are around 78,000 design firms, that includes architecture as well, in the UK. And obviously designers work in a lot of other firms that aren't design firms as well and add value there. So that's a huge number of people. But when you start to then add and include the number of people that are using design skills, the number becomes even bigger. So we found that around 2.5 million people use design skills in their day-to-day work in the UK. Those are skills like creative problem solving, prototyping, empathic thinking. So skills that we know are also integral and vital to the kind of future of work and the way that work is changing at the moment. They also generate even more value. So we found that actually when you add all of that up, that generates around 209 billion pounds worth of value to the UK and is growing proportionally at a faster rate than any other part of the economy. And also design skills are very closely linked to productivity as well. So we found that industries using design skills are almost £10 per hour more productive than the UK average. So that's a lot about the kind of economic success story, for want of a better phrase, of design. But even back in that initial research, we found some real significant challenges to really unlocking design's potential to the UK. The first one is that there's significant regional inequality in terms of access to and presence of design, with London being home to around 30% of all design firms. And over the last year, research undertaken by the Creative Industries Federation and Oxford Economics showed just how at risk design, like many other sectors, has been from the COVID-19 pandemic. So as part of their work, they also looked into the impact that it might have on the design economy and found that up to 37 billion in GVA was at risk through the changes that COVID had on the ways in which we work, and that also could lead to a potential loss of 300,000 jobs. And of course, design also faces a significant diversity challenge, and that's really important, not only because it's affecting the kind of equity of the design sector, but also results in the design things and the outputs in the world reinforcing structural inequalities that we know design needs to address. So Design Economy found that whilst around 63% of design students identify as female, around 78% of designers in the design workforce identify as male, and also that Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities are significantly underrepresented in senior positions. Again, this is an area which we're really keen to explore and research further in the next stage of Design Economy 2021. And one of the big challenges there is also trying to open up and expand new data sources, new data sets, which allows to have a kind of richer picture of diverse identities and their representation in the design economy, not least because a lot of the historical data sets that we have still rely on outdated kind of binaries, in the case here of gender, for example. So over the last 18 months, there's been a real resurgent interest in expanding the kinds of value that we look to consider in decision-making within architecture and design. We've seen things like the RIBA's incredible social value for architecture toolkit. The Construction Innovation Hub has also been developing a new kind of total impact framework that will allow people working in the construction sector to measure their social, environmental, and economic impact. And it's kind of clear why we need to kind of expand the kinds of value that we're thinking about when we talk about design. If it's the case that we're going to meet our net zero targets, for example, we need to drastically rethink how we design and how we assess its value. And similarly as well, COVID-19 has exacerbated existing social inequities already at play that we know design needs to address. So really the challenge is how can we make visible these often invisible values and impacts that design brings to the world? There's already been a load of incredible kind of case studies and projects shared through the festival that kind of highlight the social and environmental value that design brings. But I just really want to quickly share 3 case studies that have really helped to shape and inform our own thinking in developing Design Economy 2021. So the first is a town. So this is a picture of Amble. It's a fishing port in Northumberland that had experienced the loss of old industries such as coal mining and a decline in fishing, which was a key source of income and revenue for those living there. And as a result of that, they were experiencing high rates of unemployment. So Design Council worked with the local community to design and develop a new strategy that would harness existing assets in the town with a real focus on creating opportunities for self-employment. And so having gone through that process, Amble have been able to attract around £8 million of investment in regeneration, including the production of a new hotel and 400 homes. And they went to win on the Coastal Community High Street Award in 2015. And the point I kind of wanted to raise with this wasn't so much the kind of economic success story or even the details of the case study, but to also emphasize the ways in which that work also had overlapping significant social benefits. So there's a great video online for this case study. I think it's on the Design Council's website if you want to have a look at it, where members of the local community share the importance that this had in terms of sense of belonging, civic pride, sense of opportunity as well. So these kind of really crucial social benefits that design can bring to a space or a place that so often are ignored or not made fully visible in our decision making about how design can be used to improve the places that we live in. So the second example was one shared by one of our Design Council ambassadors, Dr. Teo Adebowale, and this is the Salford Flood Alleviation Scheme. So when this scheme was initially proposed, they suggested doing a kind of concrete flood barrier that would reduce the risk of flooding to nearby residents. And from a very early stage in the project, they decided to expand the brief and to take a design-led approach that would involve the local community in the decision-making about what this flood alleviation scheme should be. And what they did was they really asked, how might this scheme become a local community asset? So they worked with guest experts and they came up with this idea of producing an urban wetland. And clearly this would have multiple social and environmental benefits. So on the environmental side, urban wetlands are great because they reduce flood risks, they filter water, and they can act as carbon stores. And what they did in this case as well was they also planted around 10 hectares of wildflower habitats to increase biodiversity in the area. And then one of the ripple effects of that was that also then, by extension, brought a lot of social benefits. So Salford Wetlands has now become a valued site for leisure and amenity, somewhere to go that's beneficial for our physical and mental well-being, and a space to engage with nature. And I guess, again, what I want to kind of emphasize here is that design brings significant social and environmental impact, often those things being interrelated. And it's also vitally important that we involve communities in discussions at the early stages of design projects in terms of the kinds of values that they want to see realized. But as I've said before with that definition of design, design isn't simply done by professional designers. And it's often this stuff that's really hard to capture in research. So this final project that I wanted to share is from a piece of research that was led by Design Council Design Associates Mark Cairns and Umi Lovecraft Baden-Powell this year. And this is actually a screenshot of a microsite which we put together, which shares all of the research findings. And you can see the URL on the bottom of the screen. The project was called Design Differently. It was supported by the Emerging Futures Fund, which is part of the National Lottery Community Fund and supported by the local trust. And what it did was it brought together more than 20 community organisations from across the UK to ask how they were using design to reimagine and create local spaces and services. The project that you can see here was the Portland Inn project, based in Stoke-on-Trent. And what they did there was they used kind of design to take an abandoned pub and to reimagine what a public house might be. It's a great example of where design has been used to create to turn, rather, a kind of underutilized asset into an essential space. In this case, a civic hub, a kind of creative and social enterprise. And also, again, a really great example of where incredible design is happening that's often very easy to miss or kind of ignore when we talk about what value design is actually bringing to the UK. So before I say a little bit about the new approach that we're taking to Design Economy 2021, I think it's worth acknowledging that I'm sure many of you here already recognize that there's a huge amount of social and environmental value that design brings. And one of the kind of challenges that kind of came up as we were kind of iterating and testing this research was that it's still the case that economic values tend to dominate decision making. And I guess what I'd kind of suggest to that in response is that actually taking this kind of wider value approach really does make sense from a kind of business perspective as well. So it allows us to recognize the actual total value that we're bringing, to make visible the invisible value that's often already there and hidden. And that thereby allows us to make more informed decisions on what design we should be doing and what impact we want to achieve in the world. But for us, we also think it's really important as well that we're doing better reporting and being more transparent about the kinds of impacts that we're having in design, and to really use that as well as a kind of behavior change tool to bring these values to wider awareness. And so that's something that we really hope that Design Economy can contribute to as a piece of work. So what are we doing this time around? So our work this year is being guided by sort of three kind of very big, ambitious questions. The first is, well, what role can design play to build back better and to create a more just, healthy, and regenerative world? What does a design economy look like in 2050 that has achieved that? So not simply trying to understand what the current state of design is, but to imagine potential futures that we should be aspiring for. And crucially for us, what insight into the current and potential value of design do we need to make that shift? So for us, what we want to do is make sure that this research is useful and actionable. And so we'll be undertaking over the next 3 years, from this summer till the beginning of 2024, a national programme of research that will help us to understand the current and future value of design to the UK. Rather than publishing a static report, we've also really tried to think about how do we make that evidence and that insight useful to actors across the design sector. And so we'll be developing a digital platform that will curate new data, evidence stories, and toolkits that people can use and draw on from across the design economy, both to kind of champion and campaign for better design, but also to help them with commissioning design and assessing their own impact. And then third, to use this as a platform for action. So to bring different people together from across the design economy in a discussion around what things matter and also what value and impact design can bring. And what we're really trying to do is to make sure that with that platform, we're taking a very audience-centered approach. So we're developing spaces for kind of policy recommendations that will come out for national and local governments, providing toolkits and resources for business and public sector leaders so that they have case studies of best use of design. Again, to take our research and develop toolkits so that designers and architects can assess their own impact in their work. And as much as possible to try and make our research open so that it can be something that's built on and developed by researchers and design educators. We're going to be launching this platform over the summer. And these are not final designed up images, but I just want to give you a bit of a sneak peek. And really just to emphasize that what we've tried to do is to think about how we also make this insight interesting, interactive, engaging, and fun. And so we're looking at how we can use data visualization, imagery, film to sit alongside text, stats, and statistics, to really kind of capture those often hard to measure or hard to assess values. And just to give a really quick sense of what we're looking at with the research this year, we've really tried to expand it out in a few kind of key ways to things that we've done previously. As I've mentioned, we're not only going to look at design's economic value, but also its social and environmental value. And to do that, we're going to be running some national surveys and demonstrator projects and workshops that will allow us to start to build a kind of coherent data set on the value that design activities bring to the UK. We're also really excited to not simply be looking at how businesses use and understand design, but also how the public sector uses and understands design as well. And that's really important. So we know from previous Design Council research from back around 2010 that up to 50% of the design sector has at some point had the public sector as a client. And so we're really keen to kind of go behind that statistic to ask how design is actually being used, what value it brings, and also what are the kind of barriers and enablers to greater use of design within the public sphere. We also want to really think about what are those kind of hidden and everyday uses and understandings of design, as in the case of the Design Differently project, that haven't been captured before. And so again, we're looking to develop a strand of surveys and workshops that will help us to assess how the public currently understand and use design. And underpinning all of that will be a real focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, how we can find new data sets and new insight that helps us to really address some of the structural challenges that we're facing within the design sector at the moment. I think it's kind of worth saying that there's a lot of incredible work that's already happening in this space across the design sector in the UK, and we're really keen to kind of share and kind of complement that work through what we're doing. And I think one of the big things that we're trying to do here is to create new data to see the bigger picture of design's potential for positive social and economic and environmental impact, so not simply focusing on particular projects. And what we're also really keen to do is to take a deliberative approach. And so over the coming months, what we'll be doing is we'll be hosting a series of workshops with different stakeholders and actors from across the design economy to have a discussion to decide what particular social, environmental, and economic values we need to be measuring and capturing when we talk about design economy through this research. And so I'm just about to finish up. I think I'm coming to my last slide. So if you've got any questions, do get them ready and we'll kind of come on to them in a moment. But I think what we really hope that this work will do is to support the design sector through the following things. First of all, we hope this work can help to increase awareness of the value of design, and particularly its in social, environmental, and economic value, and thereby inspire people across sectors to use, learn, and commission it. We also hope that this will be a kind of useful and usable piece of research, and the platform itself will also share and curate toolkits, resources, and evidence, not only from Design Council, but also very much, we hope, from other organisations and initiatives around the world. And third of all, that this can underpin new policies and resources that will increase the adoption of design with a focus on enabling positive social, economic, and environmental impact. So I'm going to leave it there, and we can take questions. But just to say as well that if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about this work, do have a look on our website. But I think I'm going to then leave it there.
Hello there. Thanks so much for that. And I wanted to kick off the question. So yes, as Bernard said, please put your questions. You can either pop them in the chat, but more helpfully on the Q&A above the chat. You can click into there and leave your questions. So I wanted to kick off with a really simple one. If you're a designer, an architect, or you're working in the industry, or you're working in the public sector, how can you get involved and connect and follow up? And are there opportunities to help shape this work going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the simplest thing to do is to sign up to our newsletter. And the reason for that is we're going to be sort of organizing these deliberative workshops to begin to work out what these values will be, but also we'll be kind of running these sort of surveys as well over the coming year. I'm really keen as well to get as many people involved in that as we can. We're also going to be launching this platform, which is going to share our research journey as we go on, and we'll have on there kind of calls to action and things to get involved in too. And so again, we will kind of announce that and share that through our newsletter. So yeah, please do sign up, and we'll have a further catch up.
Are there misconceptions about the value of design that you're encountering? What do you see? You mentioned you wanted to get a sense of some of the barriers of designers working in the public sector, but what are some of the barriers you're hitting generally?
Yeah, so I think there's a kind of few big ones, and I think that these will probably be familiar to a lot of people. I think the first one is that we still lack a kind of shared understanding of what design actually is. And I think that comes back to that point of often seeing design as something that happens at the end of a project. Once a brief has already been defined, and you kind of bring in the designer at the end to kind of finalize things up. And so we know that by doing that, we actually really miss out on the opportunity of bringing design to the front end of the process. And to really think about actually what's the kind of additional hidden indirect benefits that the design can bring. I think the second one is that actually there's still a real mismatch between how clients and investors and businesses think about value, and how designers think and talk about value as well. And so I think for us, one of the big things that we're mindful of with this work is actually how can we help to create a shared language and a bit more of a joined up approach to thinking about, what are the values that we need to talk about? How can we empower designers to speak the language of clients, investors, and businesses to make the case for these wider values that often are deprioritized in decision making?
Do you think there's also a gap in design education, or do you think actually there's an alignment, growing alignment there in terms of ideas of language and what you emphasize as important in the brief and in the execution?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it was one of the things that kind of came up as we were kind of testing and iterating this methodology over the last 6 months. So we hosted a kind of number of webinars and roundtables with different actors from across the design economy to ask, what does this research need to do? What are some of the barriers and enablers that it needs to address? And one of the things that kind of came up quite strongly is design education is doing incredible work opening up more critical, speculative design practice. Sustainability is increasingly becoming a big focal point, as is increasing diversity, equity, and sort of social justice measures in practice. But at the same time, we know that if design is going to have real change and power in that space, we need to also equip designers with the tools to actually understand their impact and to be able to advocate and talk about their impact. And so I think that there's an opportunity there to think about how things like sort of impact measurements that people are doing, not only design council but across the space, can be shared and developed with students from an early stage, so that they can also begin to talk about their work in these savvy ways that will enable them to actually get the briefs they want to do or challenge clients as they need to do, and thereby realize the impact that they can.
You mentioned the impact of COVID, and there were some big numbers there that we're tracking that fall in economic production. But what do you see as driving trends or as kind of flashpoints or danger points that have come out of COVID that are impacting the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a big question in many ways, and I guess we're also still like living through it. So, I think in a way, my suspicion is that we'll actually see that the kind of real impact on the design sector, it will materialize over the next several years, if not for anything else. But I think as well, for me, COVID has been in many ways a kind of a case where design has actually done an incredible job in responding to the challenge. And there's initiatives like Design Emergency by Paolo Antonelli and Alice Rawsthorne that are really highlighting how designers have rapidly pivoted what they're doing to create PPE, to think about graphic design campaigns, and even at an everyday community level, just thinking about my own street, the ways in which design thinking has enabled communities and neighbors to kind of support each other as well. And so I also think for me there's a little bit of hope, which is around what we can take as a design sector to think about the ways in which we have mobilized to effect real positive social change through this year, and take it forward into our work as we go on to face even bigger challenges with the climate crisis and other things.
So you mentioned ESG, essentially the kind of environmental, social, and governance, but also you'd mentioned economic as well. So do you see that as a big focus? I mean, we see the investment aligning along those terms. We see developers increasingly setting net zero targets, but also making commitments to social impact, making commitments to reach certain biodiversity or other benchmarks. So do you see that as do you see the design industry aligning by itself, or do you think it needs that leadership from the design council? Does it need a more cohesive alignment with the way investment and developers are turning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think there's definitely a shift in the air, and I think you're absolutely right that we're now seeing social environmental value more heavily featured in kind of procurement policies. We're seeing, people like the National Infrastructure Commission really championing this stuff as kind of core principles for design. And I think also from a kind of economics lens as well, we're seeing a real kind of shift in terms of economic thinking to recognize that actually GDP is not a sufficient measure for how good things are going. We also need to recognize that the economy is embedded within a planet. It has social impacts, and all of these things are interdependent. I mean, I guess in terms of the question on leadership, I mean, for me, I think it's a collective thing. And I think that kind of comes back to the point that actually it's not for any one person or organization to say this is what's valuable and this is what matters. I think that has to be a deliberative discussion across actors. And I guess for us with design economy, I think one of the ambitions that we have is that whilst we'll undertake original research and we'll be thinking this through, we also really want that platform to be a kind of resource that can share and connect to and link and amplify other amazing projects and initiatives that are already happening in this space.
So you mentioned that donut and being within that donut, those planetary boundaries. There's also some, I suppose, some division, at least, if you read social media in climate circles, there are the people kind of vying for what you could see as a design or technological solution through carbon capture and these, kind of grand ideas, but then those who talk about the need to, reuse buildings, consume less, make less, and create less carbon to start with. And I guess, both can be considered design, and both can be considered to have a social and environmental purpose. Would you seek to be wading into that debate, or, I guess, where do you see yourselves in that tension?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And, I think as you highlight as well, I mean, the statistic that often comes up that I found really shocking is that I think it's the built environment in the UK contributes 40% of our total carbon emissions, which is kind of scary. I suppose for something, like design economy, in a way, we have to kind of do the research and do the work, and then that allows us to make decisions on where to kind of go. But I think one thing that we were sort of really thinking about with this research is it's incredibly hard to come up with single numbers and kind of big blanket kind of assessments on positive climate impact or positive social impact. And that what we needed to do was to really kind of think about, yes, where can we find kind of national data, but also where we can find examples of real positive impact, and then ask what would happen if those different approaches were then scaled up or utilized at a wider level. And so I would hope that some of those things are things that we'll kind of look at through that kind of approach. So, what would be the positive impact of, kind of retrofitting a project, retrofitting a building versus, a new build, and, what would happen if a certain scenario kind of comes up. And I think the kind of last thing to say on that as well is I think that's also where the kind of futures aspect of the research, for me personally, is really exciting. What we're wanting to do is kind of take a very design-led approach to this. So rather than using that as a kind of, here's a prediction of what will happen to the design economy, it's actually, again, what kinds of futures do different actors from across that space see as desirable or terrifying or future or kind of possible, to have that more plural view so that it can kind of help to inform the kind of debates and discussions that you're kind of mentioning.
One of the things that I always think about in terms of adding up the value of design is the flip side, which are kind of the fees that people earn and the kind of insecure living in some areas of the design industry. And, linking that up with your statistic about 78% of the design workforce being male, do you think there is a connection between this idea of the valuing of design and how designers are paid and structured and supported in the country?
Yeah, I think that's again a really interesting question, and I mean, my personal answer probably be, how can it not be? And I think you're absolutely right that. Well, interestingly, so I think the Design Economy 2018 actually found that on average, designers are paid more than the UK average. But actually, the reasons for that are most likely because different kinds of design professions will be paid different amounts. So I would have thought that a kind of service designer or a UX designer probably has a far higher average salary than, say, an architect does. We know as a sector that's significantly underpaid. And so again, there's a kind of thing about being actually very specific in those kinds of discussions, like which areas of design are possibly properly remunerated and which ones aren't. And how does that then relate to the investment that's required by someone in terms of training or skills or regulation? Again, architecture being a great example of where there's a real mismatch there. But I think you're right. It tends to be that we kind of give salaries to reflect we think the value of something would be. And I think again that comes into the issue of actually, as a sector, we need to probably do a little bit better at actually demonstrating the value that we have. And I think that's where organizations like Design Council and others can hopefully play a bit of a supporting role.
I'm just going to remind people that there are enough minutes left in the session. So if you have any questions, I will put them out, but I'm quite happy to just carry on interviewing you, Bernard, but I wanted to provide that opportunity to the audience. I think to join the discussion too, if you would like. I think one of the things that I took from your presentation, I really love the pencil drawing, the hand, heart, and the third H, which I've just forgotten.
Yeah,
head, heart, and hand, and I feel like that's something that people can really understand. I mean, it's such a beautifully encapsulated definition of design. Is that kind of your hope for Design Economy 21? Will it be beautifully simple, or actually, what we're looking at is grappling with complexity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be a bit of a balance of both. I think, there's always the benefit of simplifying things is it makes it really tangible and accessible. And I think, because we're trying to really engage with multiple stakeholders, multiple people involved in the design economy, they're going to be coming with different interests and needs and also levels of understanding already. And so I think one of the things that we've been doing a lot in the background is actually kind of thinking through who are kind of, in the standard way, who are our key audiences for this research and what are the things that would be of interest to them and what sort of terms or ideas might we need to explain a little bit more. But I also think that in parallel to having moments of simplicity, I think we need to also be honest about the kind of complexity of these things as well. These aren't like kind of simple, design economy is an incredibly complex ecosystem of different actors and stakeholders. And so I think for us, it's about having a balance. It's really, thinking through like what are the kind of key things that we might need to use to inform policy, for example, but also how do we make case studies really simple and tangible. But on the other hand, when we're doing the research, also like where can we acknowledge really interesting structural complexities or issues as well.
We're seeing through a lot of these projects that we're looking at this week through the pineapples, a kind of renewed commitment to listening to communities, working with communities, to letting communities either lead or participate fully in the design process. Is that something that that runs at odds with the design education, or is that something that is becoming more accepting that we need to kind of respect the expertise of the citizen alongside the designer?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect it's probably a little bit in terms of which program you're in and which space, but I think from my own experience of kind of lecturing, I think students are doing incredible amounts of really innovative work and thinking, even at that stage, in terms of how they can decenter their position as a designer and become less of an expert and more of a facilitator or a listener, or just an enabler of change. But again, I also think actually that's an area where we could think about how we could continue to even better support students as well, because there's a lot of really complicated ethical questions in there as well, and just simple practice around how you kind of go out and engage communities. And similarly as well, how you do that in a non-extractive way when you're kind of undertaking a degree, as much as when you're doing that professionally too. And so I hope that what we kind of continue to see is more of that work happening. And as design continues to evolve as well, more of those skills being shared back in to the design education system.
That seems like a really significant shift to me, to kind of decenter the designer when we think of them, certainly in architecture. We often think of the singular architect, although we know it's a team effort. So the idea of decentering the designer while still retaining them as a valuable member, that enabler of change. It's almost like there's a new definition needed or a new understanding of their role. Do you think the public has yet to really grasp that shift, or is that something that we need to do quite strategically?
Yeah, I think it's something that we probably need to do more of and to make more visible. it was sort of interesting. One of the kinds of things that the Design Differently program was looking at was what are people's kind of association with the word design, and what does it evoke to them, and what does it mean to them? And interestingly, a lot of the community organizations that were doing incredible, what we would call design work, were very hesitant to self-ascribe in that way. They said, oh, we're not doing design. We see design as being a kind of luxury lifestyle kind of choice and activity. It's not this essential community work and social change work that we're undertaking. And I think that kind of says something about actually how in the public kind of realm we need to be talking and thinking about design, how we can change that narrative a little bit more.
Or change all the job titles from architect or graphic designer to change enabler. And
yeah, that would be amazing. And I have to say that I've seen, I mean, some organizations are doing that. So, I mean, I think Civic Square have been doing some really amazing work.
Some incredible job titles. Yes. Yeah. Rethinking their roles and rethinking how they describe them. I think one of the things that we found in community engagement was that some people were sending in, for example, more junior members of staff or different kinds of individuals to lead it, so that there wasn't intimidation from a design professional. This idea that their level of education would be intimidating to someone who didn't go to university or was trying to engage on a parallel. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned about language, and that being really important, to have people speak the same language, or be, feel that they can speak the same language. And in your experience of academia has its own language sometimes. So it's that kind of that sense that, can we find a shared way of talking around these challenges and actually not have that expertise be associated with kind of all knowing or all seeing or intimidating presence around the table.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And that is a skill as well, that, is how you kind of, as a designer or an architect, you kind of translate what you're doing and find middle ground in ways that are relevant. And I think actually as well, that's, this is, again, I think, speaking personally, I think that's actually where design can actually learn a lot from education and education practice. I think teachers, educators are incredible at kind of doing that translation work and thinking and finding ways of involving, your audience or your students, your participants in kind of new and engaging ways. And so I think there's a really important kind of overlap and conversation there to be had.
Brilliant. Well, we're actually coming up to time. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, Bernard, and for sharing your plans for Design 21. There's a link in the chat. So I know that there's some ways that you can continue to engage. So subscribe to the Design Council newsletter. There's a link there. And also to visit Design Differently at designdifferently.com. And as for Design 21, when do they start watching and looking? And when do you expect your results?
Yeah, so I think platform's going to be launched sort of in the next few weeks, so keep your eyes peeled. I think we're hoping to start kind of sharing results towards the kind of autumn, the end of this year as well. But we'll also be sharing other stories, case studies and narratives as we go on before then as well. So as soon as it's launched, I'd say keep your eyes peeled and do sign up and get involved.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to take a short, bask in your emoji applause. And
amazing. Thanks so much, everyone. This is so good.
And we will be back on the hour at 2:00 with the shortlist for International Future Place. We're going to be doing a bit of a whirlwind tour around the globe. We're going to Baghdad and Bucharest and Lyon. So we'll see you then. And thanks for tuning in.
Thanks. See you, everyone.